My name is Dana Whitfield, and I was 31 the year my family set my father's letter on fire in his own dining room, 4 days after we buried him, while his ashes were still sitting in a box on the mantel, because nobody had agreed on where to scatter them. My stepbrother Trey struck the match. My stepmother Carol held the letter steady over the good crystal ashtray so it wouldn't blow out, and she watched it curl black at the edges the way you'd watch a marshmallow, almost peaceful about it. Nobody in that room asked me if I wanted to read it first. Nobody in that room knew I already had. I want to start there, at the ashtray, because that's the image that wakes me up at 2 in the morning even now, a year and a half later. But if I'm going to tell you the whole thing, I have to go back 9 years, to the winter my father got sick, and the house on Larkspur Lane became the only place any of us went for Sunday dinner, and I became the only one who actually showed up. Welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, this is where I tell you the story exactly the way it happened. No names changed except the ones that matter, and I need you to stay with me until the end, because the part everybody thinks is the twist isn't. The real twist doesn't show up until the 90th day. Drop a comment and subscribe before we start, because this one gets worse before it gets better, and I don't want you to miss where it turns. My father, Walter Whitfield, married Carol when I was 14. I liked her fine for the first few years. She brought Trey with her, a boy 2 years older than me who never once called our house his home, not even after 20 years of living 40 minutes away from it and coming over exactly twice a year. My mother had died when I was 9, and by the time Carol moved in, I'd already learned how to run a kitchen, do laundry for two, and keep a grown man from forgetting to eat when he got absorbed in his workshop. I kept doing all of that. Carol was kind in the early years, the kind that costs nothing, and then Trey went off to college in Ohio and came back with an MBA and an opinion about everything, and somewhere in there the kindness got thinner, like a coat of paint you can start to see the wood grain through. My father ran a small engineering firm out of a converted garage behind the house, 12 employees at his best years, contracts with 2 counties for bridge inspection work. He built that business from a used truck and a slide rule, and I grew up hearing him talk through problems out loud at the dinner table because there was nobody else to talk to about steel fatigue and load ratios. I went into nursing instead of engineering, but I understood him in a way Trey never bothered to try to. Trey went into finance and called our father's business, a lifestyle company, once at Thanksgiving, like it was something a person did instead of something a person built. In the fall of 2016, my father was diagnosed with a slow-moving cancer, the kind that gives you years if you're careful and takes them from you one at a time regardless. I was 25. I had my own apartment across town, a job at Meridian General on the cardiac floor, and a life that was mine. I gave most of it up over the following 8 years without ever making a decision to. First, it was just Sunday dinners. Then it was driving him to chemo on Tuesdays because Carol said she got carsick on the highway. Then it was managing his medications after his oncologist changed the regimen 3 times in 1 year, and I taped the schedule to his refrigerator in blue tape, the same way I did for my patients, because that's the only way I know how to keep a person alive on paper as well as in fact. Carol stayed married to him the whole time, technically. She kept her side of the bed. She made his appointments sound impressive at church. But by 2019, she was spending 4 nights a week at what she called her sister's place in Hartwell, an hour and a half away, and Trey visited twice a year, at Christmas and on Father's Day, and stayed under 2 hours both times. I moved into the house in the spring of 2020, gave up a 2-bedroom with a dishwasher I actually loved, and slept in my childhood bedroom for the next 4 years so that my father would never be alone overnight. Not once, not for a single night, from March of 2020 until the morning he died in April of last year. I kept working. I picked up nights at the hospital and days at the house, and somewhere in that arrangement I stopped having a life that belonged only to me, and I want to be honest that I didn't resent it, not for years. My father was funny and stubborn, and he taught me how to read a blueprint and how to argue a point without raising my voice, and every single evening he was still alive was an evening I would have chosen again. The resentment came later, and it came from other people, not from him. In the last 6 weeks, he started getting his affairs in order in a way that felt different from the ordinary caution of a man who knew his numbers were bad. He asked me twice to drive him to see a lawyer, a woman named Renata Ford, who had an office above the pharmacy on Elm Street, and both times he wouldn't tell me what it was about. I sat in the waiting room with a magazine about fishing boats while he was in there for close to an hour. When he came out, he had a manila envelope that he put in the bottom drawer of his desk in the workshop, under a stack of old invoices, and he told me not to worry about it. I didn't open it. I want that on the record because within a week of his death, more than one person in my family stood in that kitchen and implied that I had. He died on a Thursday morning in April, at home, in the bed he'd shared with my mother 30 years earlier and with Carol for 20 after that, though Carol wasn't there that week. I was there. I did the things I've done for strangers 100 times over the course of my career, the last, quiet, practical things a body needs done for it, and then I sat on the floor of his bedroom with my back against the dresser until the sun came all the way up over the workshop roof. Then I called Carol. Then I called Trey. Within 2 days, the house was full of people who hadn't set foot on Larkspur Lane in years. Carol reorganized the pantry while the funeral home was still confirming the time of the service. Trey walked through every room like he was doing inventory, which, it turned out later, he basically was. Nobody asked me what my father had said in his last weeks, whether he'd been in pain, what he talked about at 3 in the morning when it was just the two of us and the hum of the oxygen machine. They asked me where he kept the title to the truck. The funeral was on a Tuesday. The reception was back at the house because the house was still, in every practical sense, the house, even though legally it hadn't been decided whose house it was going to be. Carol set the dining table with the good china and put me at the far end near the kitchen door, which if you've ever been the person expected to keep refilling the coffee pot, you already know is where they seat you. There was a stack of mail on the counter that had been piling up for a week, the ordinary kind, sympathy cards and a utility bill, and underneath it, a plain white envelope that I recognized instantly because I had watched my father carry it out of Renata Ford's office 6 weeks earlier and lock it in his desk drawer. Someone had gone into that drawer. I found out later it was Trey, on the second day, while I was at the funeral home picking out a casket by myself. Carol brought the stack to the table while people were still eating deli sandwiches off paper plates. She opened the white envelope with a butter knife, the same one she'd used to spread mustard 30 seconds earlier, and she read it silently first, and her face did something I had never seen it do in 17 years of knowing her. Then she read it out loud. It wasn't a check. My father hadn't left me cash sitting in an account somewhere. What he had done, 6 weeks before he died, sitting in Renata Ford's office while I read a fishing magazine 40 feet away, was execute an irrevocable trust and transfer the deed to the workshop building, the 12-employee engineering business that came with it, and the mineral rights under 11 acres behind the house into that trust, naming me as sole beneficiary and trustee, effective immediately upon his death. No probate required, no court needed to bless it. Because an irrevocable trust funded and recorded while he was alive simply isn't part of the estate that gets divided up later. Carol read the appraisal figure attached to the trust documents out loud, twice, so nobody in the room could pretend they'd misheard it. $2.8 million, most of it in the business itself, and the mineral lease a gas company had been trying to get my father to sign for 6 years. Trey stood up so fast his chair scraped the floor. He said the word unbelievable a few times, not to me, to the room, the way you'd narrate a disaster to people who weren't watching it happen. Carol set the papers down flat on the tablecloth, smoothed them with both hands the way you'd smooth a napkin, and told me I would never see a dime of it, that they would fight it, that a dying man doesn't know what he's signing. Then Trey picked the whole packet up off the table, walked it over to the fireplace, and set it in the crystal ashtray my mother had bought at an estate sale 30 years earlier. Carol lit a match. Nobody in that room moved to stop them, including my own father's oldest friend, a man named Curtis who had known him since before I was born and just sat there with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand. I want to tell you I screamed. I didn't. I stood in the kitchen doorway, and I watched paper curl and blacken over crystal, and something in me went very still and very clear, the way it does in a hospital room when a patient's numbers start dropping, and every wasted second is a second you don't get back. Because I already knew something that nobody else in that room knew yet, and it's the reason I'm sitting here telling you this story, instead of somewhere still trying to prove what my father wanted. Renata Ford had told me, weeks earlier, when I finally worked up the nerve to ask her directly what was in that envelope, that an irrevocable trust properly funded and recorded doesn't live and die with a piece of paper sitting in a house. It lives in the county recorder's office and in a certified digital file in her own office safe, and burning somebody's personal copy of the documents is exactly like burning your copy of a deed to your car. It's inconvenient. It changes nothing about who owns the car. I let Carol and Trey believe, for the next several minutes, that they had just destroyed my inheritance in front of a room full of witnesses, and I did not correct them, because I wanted to see what they'd do next when they thought I had nothing left. What they did next was worse than the fire. 3 days later, a woman from Adult Protective Services knocked on the door at 9 in the morning. She was polite about it, apologetic even, and I want to be fair to her because she didn't write the complaint. She only had to investigate it. Somebody in my family had reported that I had isolated my father from his other relatives in his final year, controlled his medications in a way that gave me leverage over him, and pressured a dying man into signing away the family business while under the influence of pain medication. She asked me who administered his morphine dosing. I told her the truth that I did, because I'm a licensed nurse and there wasn't anyone else in that house qualified to do it safely. She wrote that down, and I watched her write it down, and I understood in real time how something true and something damning can be the exact same sentence. The same week, a letter arrived from a law firm in Columbus. 4 pages, very polite, informing me that Carol, in her capacity as surviving spouse, was petitioning the probate court to void the trust on grounds of undue influence and lack of testamentary capacity, on the theory that a man on hospice-adjacent pain management cannot meaningfully consent to giving away 80% of his net worth to one child and excluding a wife of 17 years and a stepson entirely. Attached as an exhibit was a photocopy of the medication log I had taped to my father's refrigerator for 4 years, my own handwriting, every dose and every adjustment, offered as proof of what the filing called the extent of the caregiver's control over the decedent's cognitive state. They had taken the most careful thing I had ever done for another human being and turned it into the evidence against me. I found a lawyer the following week, a semi-retired attorney named Harold Prout who kept an office above a hardware store and a coffee maker older than I was. He read the filing with his glasses pushed up on his forehead and told me the same thing Renata Ford had already told me over the phone, but he said it slower so it would actually land. The trust itself, he said, tapping one side of a pen laid flat on his desk, is a finished transaction. Recorded, funded, executed while your father was, by every medical record in this file, of sound mind. Nobody can unfund a properly executed irrevocable trust just by filing a complaint about it. But he said, tapping the other side of the pen, they absolutely can make your life miserable trying, and a caregiver who inherits starts every fight one step behind, because the law has seen 100 cases where the person bringing the pills was also the person emptying the bank account, and a judge has to rule that out before ruling anything else in. What followed was the ugliest 90 days of my life, and I'm not using that number by accident, because in my family, it turns out, 90 days is exactly how long people can behave badly before the paperwork simply outruns them. The gas company holding the mineral lease put their signing bonus on hold pending litigation, which meant the trust technically owned an asset worth close to $1 million that I could not touch a cent of. The engineering business needed a signature from the trustee to keep its county contracts active, and Carol's attorney sent a letter to both counties suggesting that my authority to sign as trustee was itself under legal challenge, which was a lie, but a lie that took the county clerk's office 11 days to sort out, during which 2 of my father's 12 employees quietly took jobs elsewhere because nobody could tell them whether they'd have a paycheck in a month. I watched a business my father built over 40 years bleed out slowly because 2 people wanted to punish me more than they wanted it to. Survive, my cousin Renee, the only person in that extended family who ever called my father by his first name instead of Uncle Walter like a title, drove out to see me with a cooler of groceries and wouldn't come past the porch. You should know what they're saying, she told me. They're saying you got him to sign it at the end when he was confused. I asked who they was. She looked at the porch boards and said, everybody, and 2 weeks later she stopped answering my texts entirely, and I understood, because she worked at a bank in the same small town Carol's sister lived in, and small towns have a way of making everyone's job depend on staying on the right side of the loudest version of a story. The lowest point came in the sixth week, when Trey's lawyer sent a settlement offer that I sat with for 40 minutes at my kitchen table with a pen in my hand, in the rain, in a house I no longer knew if I was allowed to be living in. The offer was $200,000, a fraction of what the trust actually held, in exchange for three things. I would voluntarily resign as trustee, the Adult Protective Services complaint would be quietly withdrawn, and I would sign a single paragraph on the last page stating that I acknowledged my father's testamentary capacity at the time of the trust's execution was, in the document's own careful language, reasonably disputed. $200,000 and my nursing career intact, in exchange for putting my own name on a sentence that called my father a confused old man in his last weeks. I had the pen on the paper. I want to be honest with you about that, because I think the honest version of this story matters more than the tidy one. I was tired in a way that had nothing to do with money. I wanted somebody, anybody, in that family to stop looking at me like a thief. And for about 40 minutes in the rain, $200,000, and an apology I didn't owe felt like it might be worth signing away the truth for. What stopped me was a folder Renata Ford had given me 3 weeks earlier and told me not to open unless I needed it. She'd said my father had asked her, on the same afternoon he signed the trust, to record something else, a short video statement, the kind she has every client do now for exactly this reason, him sitting in her office chair stating his own name, the date, the fact that no one had coerced him, and naming, specifically and by name, every relative he was choosing not to leave anything to and why. I hadn't watched it. I couldn't make myself watch it until that night in the rain with the pen in my hand. He looked thin in it, and tired, and completely, entirely himself, sharp as a blueprint line, and at the end of it he said something I hadn't been in the room to hear him say out loud before. That he loved Carol once, and he was grateful to her for a long time, and that he loved Trey the way you love a stranger's kid who happens to share your holidays, but that Dana was the only person who had shown up for 8 straight years, without once being asked to, and that he would rather leave the business to the one person who understood what it took to build it, than to the 2 people who only ever asked him what it was worth. I put the pen down. I called Harold Prout at 9 at night and told him to prepare the video for evidence and to tell Carol's attorney the offer was rejected in full. The turn came 6 weeks after that, and it came from the direction I least expected. Trey's own financial disclosures, filed as part of discovery because he was arguing that the trust had deprived him of an inheritance he was entitled to, showed a series of transfers out of Carol's joint account with my father over the previous 3 years, money that had gone, in pieces of $3,000 and $4,000, into an investment Trey had personally recommended to his mother, an investment that turned out to be a real estate fund that had quietly collapsed the year before. Taking $81,000 of my father's retirement savings with it, my father had found the statements in the last year of his life. He never told me, he never called a lawyer over it, never confronted Carol publicly, and he never took her name off the house. What he did instead, 6 weeks before he died, was walk into Renata Ford's office and make absolutely sure that the one asset Carol and Trey couldn't touch was the one asset that would actually keep his life's work alive. Harold Prout read the disclosure with his glasses back down on his nose and said the sentence I've thought about more than almost anything else that happened that year. He didn't do this to punish them, Dana. He did this because he'd already been quietly betrayed by the 2 people asking you to prove you hadn't betrayed him, and he ran out of time to say so to their faces, so he said it in the only language that outlives an argument. A document. The hearing was scheduled for late July, in a small courtroom with a window unit that rattled the blinds every time it cycled on. Renata Ford testified for 35 minutes about the standard intake procedure her office uses for exactly this kind of client, memory screening, a private conversation with no family present, a recorded statement of intent. My father's oncologist testified that in his final competency evaluation, 6 days before the trust was signed, Walter Whitfield had correctly named the sitting president, done serial 7s without an error, and asked the doctor a pointed, entirely lucid question about a clinical trial he'd read about that morning. The judge watched 11 minutes of the video statement in open court, my father's voice filling a room that had spent 3 months being told he didn't have one anymore, and dismissed the petition from the bench before the lunch recess. Adult Protective Services closed its file the same month with a formal finding of no exploitation, and quietly noted, though nobody made me acknowledge it out loud, that the original complaint had been made by a family member with an active financial dispute pending against the same estate. Trey didn't go to prison. That's the part people always want me to lie about when I tell this story, and I won't. He filed a case, he lost it, and he went back to Ohio, and losing a case like that cost him a legal bill and a business relationship or two, and not much else that the world could see from the outside. Carol still tells her version of this at church, and it's a good version, and half that town believes it, and probably always will. I stopped trying to correct it sometime around September. The business survived barely. I kept 2 of my father's 12 employees and hired 3 more, and the gas company signed the lease the week after the ruling, and I used part of that money to give every remaining employee a retroactive raise for the 3 months they'd worked without knowing if they'd get paid, because that felt like the only apology I was in a position to actually give anybody. I still live in the house on Larkspur Lane. I go into the workshop most mornings before my hospital shift, and I sit at my father's old drafting table for 10 minutes with a cup of coffee before I do anything else, not because I need to, but because it's the only version of a conversation with him I have left, and I'm not ready to give it up. The crystal ashtray is gone. I threw it out myself, the week after the ruling, because I never wanted to look at it again, and because it turns out you can burn a piece of paper and lose absolutely nothing that matters, and some people spend a great deal of energy finding that out the hard way. People ask me if it was worth $2.8 million, and it's the wrong question, the same way it would have been the wrong question the day of that fire, because the money was never the thing my family was trying to destroy at that table. What they were trying to destroy was 8 years, and 8 years doesn't burn. It turned out to be the one thing in that house none of them could get their hands on, no matter how many matches they had. If this story reminded you to ask a parent where their important documents actually are, and whether there's a second copy somewhere that isn't sitting in a drawer one relative can open before the funeral is even over, go ask this week. Don't wait for a funeral to find out what somebody meant to tell you. And if there's somebody in your life who needs to hear this one, send it to them. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next story.